Summer 1944, Kansas was hot enough to turn the tin roofs of the camp into griddles. Heat shimmered above the barbed wire, bending the horizon until the whole world looked like a mirage. Somewhere beyond the guard towers, the wheat rolled in gold waves, whispering against the wind. And in that strange moment between daylight and dusk, a smell floated across the compound, rich, buttery, smoky. Liesl Baumann stopped walking. The scent seemed to catch her by the collar and hold her still. Frying oil hissed somewhere beyond the mess hall. She closed her eyes, inhaled, and for an instant the war receded. She was a child again, barefoot on the farmhouse steps, her mother pulling chicken from the pan, laughter in the kitchen before the world turned cruel. The memory stung. She opened her eyes. Beyond the barbed wire, America smelled alive, warm, and impossible. Her boots crunched over the dusty path. She walked slowly, hands clasped behind her back, trying to look casual for the guards perched in the towers like bored crows. Greta Hoffman strolled beside her, cigarette dangling from her fingers, dark hair tied in a knot at the nape of her neck. Greta had the look of a woman who'd seen too much and refused to let it break her. "That smell again," she muttered, smoke curling from her lips. "They fry everything, don't they? Chickens, potatoes, probably us if we step out of line." "You shouldn't joke," Erica Vogel said quietly, trailing them by a few paces. At 19, Erica's pale face still carried a trace of round-cheeked girlhood, though weeks in the camp had hollowed it. She worried her bottom lip as she walked. "The guards might hear you." "They can hear my stomach better than my words," Greta said dryly, flicking ash into the dust. "Besides, what will they do? Make me eat more butter?" She shot Liesl a sidelong glance. "You've gone quiet, nurse. Thinking about home." Liesl didn't answer at once. The truth was, she had been thinking about home, about the last letter she'd received, months ago, already creased from reading. About her brother, somewhere on the Eastern Front, his handwriting stiff and formal. "We are holding the line. Do not worry." The line might be holding, but the men behind it were crumbling. She could hear it between the words. "I was thinking," she said finally, "that the smell is strange. It feels wrong to be hungry for it." Greta snorted softly. "Hunger doesn't care about borders. You'll get used to it." That was what Liesl feared most, that she might get used to it. Already her body had stopped flinching at the clang of the mess bell. Already she had begun to wake with a strange kind of anticipation, not dread. The war was far away here, softened by distance and prairie grass. Even the barbed wire looked almost harmless in the glow of sunset, a silver necklace around the camp. They passed the watchtower where a guard lounged with his rifle propped casually against the railing. He raised 2 fingers in lazy acknowledgement. Greta raised her cigarette in return, a mock salute. Liesl kept her eyes straight ahead. The Americans were a puzzle she had not yet solved, smiling one moment, sharp the next. It was easier to keep a barrier up, like the wire itself. The path ended near the mess hall, where the kitchen windows were propped open to release the heat. The smell was stronger here, grease, pepper, a faint sweetness that made Liesl's mouth water despite herself. Through the window she glimpsed the cooks, broad-shouldered men in white aprons, sleeves rolled, singing along to a radio propped near the sink. The music was jaunty, an American swing tune that made the pots clatter in time. One of the cooks, a huge man with a laugh like rolling thunder, caught sight of the women and winked. Erica blushed scarlet and turned away. "See," Greta said under her breath. "Even their cooks flirt. Must be the American way." Liesl might have smiled, but then she saw another figure near the back door, leaning against the frame with an easy posture that suggested he belonged to the place the way roots belong to soil. The guard was young, not much older than she was, his uniform sleeves rolled past sunburned elbows. He held an apple in one hand, the other hooked into his belt. His cap was pushed back, revealing hair the color of straw. When his gaze met hers, he didn't look away. Instead, he held out the apple like an offering. The gesture startled her. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood, that it was meant for someone else, but his expression was steady, almost curious. She hesitated, the world narrowing to the space between them, the smell of frying food suddenly sharp. Greta murmured something about going back to the barracks and tugged Erika away, leaving Liesel standing alone. The guard stepped forward and tossed the apple gently. She caught it, the skin cool against her palm. He gave a small nod, as though satisfied, then turned back toward the kitchen. The exchange had taken less than a minute, but it felt like a boundary had shifted. That night, lying on her bunk, Liesel stared at the rafters while the camp settled into its uneasy silence. The apple sat on the stool beside her bed, a red coin in the lantern light. She should save it, she thought, or share it with Greta and Erika. But something in her resisted turning the moment into charity. Instead, she turned the fruit over and over in her hand, feeling its smoothness, its foreign weight. When she finally bit into it, the sweetness surprised her. The juice ran down her wrist, sticky, and she licked it away like a thief. The next day the air was cooler, the sky washed pale by a night storm. Liesel found herself walking near the mess hall again, almost without thinking. She half expected to see the same guard, but the steps were empty, the door shut. Disappointment caught her off guard. She busied herself with helping Erika mend a tear in her skirt while Greta hummed under her breath, a tune that almost matched the one from the cook's radio. The ordinary quiet of the morning felt fragile, as if one loud sound might shatter it. By afternoon, the heat had returned, baking the ground until the dust clung to their shoes. The clang of the mess bell jolted through the yard, and a ripple of movement passed through the camp. Liesel followed the line of women to the hall, where the smell of meat hung thick and heavy. Tonight they were served something new, chicken, coated in flour and fried until crisp. The skin crackled under her fingers as she tore it apart. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while trying not to show it. Greta devoured hers with theatrical pleasure, muttering about how their comrades back home would storm the gates if they knew. Erika's eyes shone with guilty delight. After supper, as the women lingered outside, Liesel saw the straw-haired guard again. He was leaning against the fence post near the yard, hands in his pockets, whistling softly. This time when their eyes met, he smiled. Not a wide grin, just a small curve that seemed to say he understood something she didn't. She felt heat rise in her face and looked away. The barbed wire between them caught the dying sunlight, threads of gold stretching from post to post. For the first time, it looked less like a wall and more like a veil. Later, in the barracks, Greta sprawled on her bunk, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. "They're fattening us up," she said, half amused. "You'll see. Next week it will be cake and cream. After that, who knows? A parade." Erika giggled and pulled her blanket tighter. Liesel said nothing. She was thinking of the apple, of the guard's quiet smile, of the strange pull in her chest when she smelled the kitchen's frying oil. She turned on her side, listening to the night settle over the camp, the distant low of cattle, the creak of the guard tower steps, the faint thrum of music from the radio. Sleep came slowly, carrying with it dreams of home that felt less heavy than before. She saw her brother laughing in the farmhouse kitchen, her mother setting down a dish, steam rising. The dream dissolved into the image of the mess hall, of a table groaning under more food than she had seen in years, of strangers offering her a seat. She woke with a start, heart thudding. The barracks was quiet except for Greta's soft snore. Outside, dawn was just beginning to bleed into the sky. The smell of breakfast drifted through the air, eggs, coffee, bread, and for the first time Liesel felt her mouth curve into something dangerously close to a smile. The camp was still a prison, the war still raging beyond the plains, but something had shifted. The scent of frying food clung to her hair, her clothes, as if it wanted to remind her of what she had tasted. She rose from her bunk, smoothed her skirt, and stepped outside into the new light. Somewhere beyond the fence, a rooster crowed, bold and absurd. And in that moment, she realized with a start that she was no longer only counting the days until freedom. Something in her was beginning to wonder what might happen next. The first morning after the apple, Liesel found herself standing straighter in the breakfast line, as though something inside her had been wound and released. The smell of coffee hung in the air like incense, and when the cook ladled oatmeal into her bowl, she noticed how creamy it was, thick with milk. Erika cradled hers with both hands, steam rising to her face, eyes half closed as though in prayer. Greta, behind them, winked at the nearest guard and muttered that if the war lasted long enough, they'd all return to Germany fatter than field hens. Liesel tried to hush her but couldn't suppress the corner of her mouth from twitching. The humor startled her. Laughter felt dangerous, but so did hope. Outside, the sun had burned away the mist and left the sky a hard, shining blue. The camp hummed with quiet industry, guards walking their rounds, prisoners carrying laundry, the occasional truck rumbling in from the road. And always, somewhere, a radio played. American music seemed determined to stitch itself into the air, jaunty trumpets and warm crooning voices that didn't seem to know there was a war on. At first Liesel had found it irritating, a reminder that the enemy had leisure enough to sing while the world bled. Now she found herself catching snatches of melody, her fingers tapping against her thigh before she could stop them. By afternoon, the kitchen windows were open again, and the smell that drifted out was stronger than before. Garlic, onion, some spice she couldn't name. Greta inhaled deeply and laughed. What do you think it is this time? Meat again? Perhaps they're celebrating our good behavior. Erica's brow furrowed. We shouldn't be celebrating. Not while... She broke off, biting her lip. Not while our families starve. Not while the fatherland fights for its life. The words didn't need speaking. They hovered over them like smoke. When the mess bell clanged, the prisoners filed in two neat lines, the rhythm so automatic it might have been a drill. Inside, the hall smelled like a feast. Tonight it was chicken again, but cooked differently, coated in flour and fried until the skin blistered golden. There were mashed potatoes, smooth and pale, with a well of brown gravy that gleamed under the lamps. For dessert, a square of something spiced and sweet. The room buzzed as trays clattered, boots scuffed, voices rose and fell. The Americans watched from the edges, rifles slung loose, their faces neither friendly nor hostile, merely curious. Liesel ate slowly, forcing herself not to devour it too quickly. Each bite was both comfort and accusation. She could picture her mother boiling beets into thin soup, her father breaking ration bread into careful pieces. The thought made the food taste too rich, almost shameful. And yet her body leaned toward it, starved for the very thing her conscience resisted. Greta caught her eye across the table and lifted a brow, a silent challenge. Go on, eat, we are still alive. Erica sat stiffly, hands folded after the first few bites, as though punishing herself. Liesel reached over and placed half of her chicken on Erica's tray without a word. Erica blinked, then whispered thanks. After supper, the women lingered outside in the warm air. The sky was streaked pink and violet, and somewhere a guard lit a cigarette, the ember flaring like a firefly. Then from the open door of the mess hall came the sound of a new song, bold and brassy. Greta began to sway her hips in exaggeration, laughing until Erica swatted her arm. Stop it! But she was smiling too, the first unshadowed smile Liesel had seen on her since arriving. The sound of it startled Liesel. It was bright, like a bell, cutting through the heaviness. Later, back in the barracks, Liesel sat on her bunk and brushed out her hair. The air was thick with the scent of frying oil that clung to their clothes and hair like perfume. She thought of the guard again, the one with the straw-colored hair, and the way he had smiled. It had not been mocking, not triumphant, just curious. She wondered what he thought of them, these women behind the wire, some laughing, some crying, some staring at their plates as though food could betray them. The thought was strange, almost dangerous. She pushed it away and blew out the lamp. Days passed, measured by meals and bells and the strange parade of American generosity. There was white bread so soft it could be balled in the fist, butter that melted on the tongue, and coffee that made Greta groan with pleasure every morning. One noon they were given beans baked with molasses, the sweetness so unexpected that Erica gasped aloud. Even the guards seemed amused at their reactions. Once, Liesel heard one of them call out, "Next week, buffalo wings," and the kitchen roared with laughter. The women exchanged puzzled looks. Greta whispered, deadpan, "Do buffalo fly in this country?" And they laughed until tears ran down their faces. Even Erica. The food was not the only thing changing them. The music grew louder, spilling into every corner of the camp. It came from the kitchen, from the guard towers, from the radio in the yard where the Americans gathered on Sunday afternoons. Swing tunes, love songs, triumphant marches, sounds that spoke of another world entirely. Liesel caught herself humming under her breath while hanging laundry. When she noticed, She flushed and bit her tongue. But later, alone, she let herself hum again. Letters arrived sporadically, bringing with them the sting of another world. Liesel's latest note from home was short, her mother's handwriting thinner than before. "We are well enough. Rations are tight, but we manage. Your brother has not written lately. We pray for him daily." Liesel read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it under her mattress. That night she lay awake listening to the music from the kitchen and thought of her brother, hungry somewhere far away, perhaps lying in mud, perhaps already gone. The guilt pressed against her ribs like a weight. She turned her face to the wall and clenched her hands until sleep came. The next morning brought rain, sudden and heavy, turning the yard into mud. The prisoners splashed through it, skirts plastered to their legs, hair sticking to their cheeks. The kitchen windows steamed with heat as the cooks worked over boiling pots. Hank, she had finally learned his name from Greta, who had a talent for collecting gossip, stood in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He caught Liesel watching and gave a small nod, as if to say, "Yes, I see you too." It was nothing, a mere fragment of connection, but it stayed with her all through breakfast and into the afternoon. That evening, a truck rumbled into the compound, spraying mud. The gates swung wide and a new group of prisoners climbed down, blinking in the rain. They were men this time, thin and sharp-faced, uniforms hanging from their frames. One of them wore the Luftwaffe eagle on his sleeve, though it was frayed. The yard buzzed with whispers. The men looked around with guarded eyes, their expressions a mixture of relief and bitterness. The women watched from the barracks windows, curiosity sparking like static. Greta was the first to speak. "Well," she said softly, "things just got interesting." Liesel said nothing. She was staring at one of the men, a tall figure with dark hair plastered to his skull, rainwater streaming down his face. Even from a distance, she could feel something radiating from him, a kind of restless energy, coiled tight. Their eyes met for the briefest instant before he turned away, following the guard toward the intake office. Liesel felt the air shift around her, as if the camp itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. That night the rain eased, leaving the camp washed clean, the barbed wire beaded with water that caught the moonlight. Liesel lay awake long after the others had slept, listening to the distant sound of male voices murmuring in the newly filled barracks. Something was changing. The camp was no longer only a place of waiting. It was a place where things might happen. She thought of the food, the music, the apple, the guard's nod, the man's dark gaze. The threads were pulling together, though she could not yet see the pattern. She turned onto her side, heart thudding. Somewhere a dog barked, sharp against the quiet. The night seemed to hum with possibility, and for the first time she wondered not just how long she would be here, but what the camp might yet make of her. The men's presence changed the camp overnight. The yard, once quiet except for the shuffling of women's skirts and the rattle of tin trays, now pulsed with voices, laughter, arguments that rose and fell like distant thunder. Liesel felt it before she saw it. The shift in the air, as though the prairie wind had turned and brought with it something sharp, electric. The first morning after their arrival, she found herself standing in line for breakfast behind Greta, who had tilted her head toward the male barracks with interest. "They're loud," Greta remarked, cigarette bobbing in the corner of her mouth. "Loud men mean trouble or entertainment. Possibly both." Liesel kept her eyes forward, but she was listening. From across the yard came a burst of singing, rowdy, off-key, defiantly cheerful. Erica flinched. "They shouldn't sing like that," she said quietly. "Not here." "Why not?" Greta asked, amused. "We're still Germans, are we not? Perhaps it reminds them we are alive." Erica didn't answer. She had grown paler since the men arrived, her hands trembling when she carried her tray. The presence of soldiers, men who might have known her father or brother, seemed to reopen wounds she had been trying to close. Liesel understood. She, too, felt her guard tightening. There was something about seeing the men behind the wire, proud and ragged at once, that stirred conflicting emotions she could not name. By midday, word had spread. Among the new arrivals was a former Luftwaffe pilot named Kurt Weiss. Greta reported it with relish, as though she had unearthed a celebrity. "Shot down over France," she said, lowering her voice dramatically as they sat in the shade of the barracks. Survived with nothing but a broken arm. They say he walked miles before the Americans caught him. Liesel said nothing. She had noticed him already, not because of gossip but because of the way he carried himself. Even in the ill-fitting prisoner uniform, he looked like someone who had commanded attention. His dark hair had grown too long, curling at his neck, and there was a small scar just above his eyebrow, white against sun-browned skin. He spoke little, but when he did, the others fell silent, listening. That evening, Liesel saw him clearly for the first time. The prisoners were gathered near the fence after supper, the air warm and humming with insects. Kurt stood apart from the others, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the wire as if he could see across the ocean. Greta, never one to waste time, sauntered closer and offered him a cigarette. He took it with a nod and struck a match, the brief flare lighting his face. For an instant his eyes met Liesel's, and something unreadable passed between them, acknowledgement, maybe, or challenge. She looked away too quickly, her pulse hammering. The next days were restless ones. Fights broke out among the men, scuffles quickly broken up by guards. Liesel heard mutterings of escape plans, of loyalty and betrayal, of men who refused to eat the American food as a matter of pride. The women were caught in the middle, some drawn to the men's defiance, others frightened by it. Erika wept one night, whispering that she could not bear to watch another beating. Greta tried to comfort her with jokes, but even Greta's laughter sounded forced. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, black clouds piling over the prairie like cannon smoke. The camp went dark as the first drop struck, and within minutes the yard was a sea of mud. Liesel was coming from the laundry shed when she saw Kurt arguing with a guard near the gate. The words were sharp, carried by the wind, but she could not make them out. When the guard raised his rifle slightly, a warning gesture, Kurt stepped back, hands raised, but his eyes burned with something fierce. The rain plastered his hair to his head, ran down his face. For a moment he looked wild, dangerous, and completely alive. That night the mess hall buzzed with rumors. Some said Kurt had demanded better treatment for the men. Others claimed he had insulted the guard outright. Greta whispered to Liesel that she had seen Hank watching the scene, jaw clenched, as though weighing something. Liesel tried to picture Hank angry and could not. She remembered instead the quiet nods, the apple, the way his smile had seemed to cut through the fence like sunlight through cloud. The tension did not ease. A week later, 2 men attempted an escape, slipping through a gap near the east fence during a supply delivery. They were caught before they reached the tree line, dragged back in under the eyes of every prisoner. The guards lined everyone up in the yard, rain falling again like a curse. Captain Reed, the American commandant, read the punishment aloud in clipped English. Though many did not understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. The men were confined to the barracks for a week, and rations were briefly reduced for all. That night, silence hung over the camp like a shroud. Even Greta did not joke. Liesel lay awake on her bunk, staring into the dark, her stomach knotted, not from hunger, but from the way her heart had pounded as the guards dragged the escapees past. She had felt pride and fear at once, and something else she could not name. She thought of Kurt's dark eyes, of Hank's watchful stillness, of the fence that separated all of them from the lives they used to know. The next morning dawned brilliantly clear, as though the storm had scrubbed the sky. Breakfast was plain, porridge, a heel of bread, but the women ate quietly, no complaints. Outside, the men were let back into the yard, their faces set and hard. Liesel saw Kurt among them, standing tall despite the mud caked on his boots. When he caught her watching, he did not look away. Instead, he gave the smallest of smiles, brief as lightning. Later that day, Liesel found herself near the kitchen, drawn as always by the smell of food and music. Hank was there, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. He looked tired, his cap pulled low. For a moment they stood in silence, listening to the radio play a mournful tune. Then he said, in careful German, "Hard days." His accent was rough but understandable. Liesel started. She had not heard him speak her language before. "Yes," she said softly, not sure what else to offer. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "But not the worst days," he said, and there was something in his tone, something steadying. That night, when the mess bell rang, the hall was brighter than usual. the lamps glowing warmly against the clean tables. The cooks had prepared something special: beef stew thick with carrots and potatoes, warm rolls, slices of pie. The air filled with the sound of laughter and clinking spoons. Even the men ate with less defiance, hunger winning over pride. Greta tore her bread in half and pressed the larger piece into Erica's hand with a wink. For a little while, the camp felt almost like a village. Music played from the radio, and some of the men hummed along. The sound was low, almost reverent. Liesel let herself breathe, let the warmth of the stew settle in her stomach. She caught sight of Kurt at the far table, his head bowed as he ate, and of Hank standing near the wall, watching the room with unreadable eyes. But the fragile peace did not last. Just as the meal was ending, one of the guards entered with a sheaf of papers. Captain Reed read them aloud in English first, then in halting German. The news was grim. The Allies had advanced in France. Paris was nearly free. The room went still. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then a murmur rippled through the hall, sharp as wind through dry grass. Liesel's chest tightened. Paris, gone from their hands. Her brother's last letter had mentioned the Western Front, hinted that he might be sent there. She gripped her spoon until her knuckles whitened. Across the hall, Kurt's face was a mask, but his jaw was tight. Greta swore under her breath. Erica's eyes filled with tears. When they filed out into the yard, the night was unervingly quiet, stars burning cold above the wire. The men stood in knots, whispering, some gesturing angrily. Kurt stood alone, looking up at the sky as though searching for a constellation he had lost. Liesel found herself stepping closer, though she did not know why. She stopped a few paces away, the grass damp under her shoes. He turned his head slightly, sensing her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, in a voice low and even, "The war is turning." She nodded. Yes. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time she saw something flicker in his eyes that was not defiance but weariness. "We will all have to decide who we are when it ends," he said. The words lodged in her chest, heavy as a stone. She wanted to answer, but before she could, a guard's whistle cut the air. The prisoners began to disperse. Kurt gave her a last glance, unreadable, and walked back toward the barracks. Liesel stood rooted to the spot, the night wind cool against her face. The smell of stew still clung to her clothes, mingling with the sharper scent of damp earth. Somewhere near the kitchen, the radio began to play again, a slow, solemn song that seemed to echo the beat of her heart. She turned toward the barracks at last, but each step felt weighted, as though the ground itself were shifting. Something was coming. She could feel it. The fence gleamed in the starlight like a line drawn in fate, and for the first time she wondered which side of it truly held her captive. The 4th of July dawned with a kind of brilliance that made the camp seem less a prison and more a stage. The sky stretched impossibly wide, the wheat beyond the wire swaying as if applauding some secret drama. From the kitchen came sounds that had not been heard before, laughter louder than usual, pots banging, the pop and hiss of oil. The smells floated out in waves, spicy and sharp, making even Greta pause mid-step. "Whatever they're cooking," she murmured, "it smells like victory." Liesel felt the words lodge in her chest. Victory? For whom? She did not say it aloud. The yard was alive with motion, prisoners watching as the Americans set up tables under the open sky, long planks laid across sawhorses, paper flags fluttering. The guards had loosened their stance, their rifles slung casually, as if today were not a day for suspicion but for spectacle. Even Hank, normally so still, moved with a kind of quiet purpose, helping the cooks carry trays. When the bell rang, the prisoners were led out in lines, but there was none of the usual stiffness. The air buzzed with expectation. On the tables waited platters of roasted chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes crowned with melting butter, and a dish none of them had seen before, golden wings glistening with a reddish sauce that smelled of vinegar and heat. Erica stared, wide-eyed. "What is that?" "Buffalo wings," one of the cooks called, grinning. "Try them." They bite back. The line rippled with cautious laughter. Greta leaned close to Liesel. "First they fatten us, now they spice us. What next?" "A dance." But Liesel barely heard her. She was watching the table as though it might vanish. Something about the abundance, the color of it, the almost reckless generosity, struck her like a blow. She moved forward with the others, took her plate, found a place at the long bench. The sun pressed down like a blessing. When she bit into the first wing, the flavor stunned her, sharp and tangy, the heat blooming across her tongue until her eyes watered. Greta hooped beside her and grabbed for more. Erica covered her mouth, laughing and coughing at once. Around them the yard filled with sound. Voices, clatter, even music from the radio, a brass band blaring a patriotic march. The Americans were smiling now, some clapping in rhythm, a few even shouting jokes toward the tables. Liesel ate slowly, each bite a kind of surrender. She felt something inside her unclench, something that had been knotted for months. She looked around and saw that others felt it too. Greta's shoulders relaxed, Erica's face open and flushed, even some of the men smiling despite themselves. At the far table Kurt sat with his elbows braced, eating with grim focus. His eyes flicked up, found hers across the yard, and held them. For a moment the noise fell away. He gave the smallest shake of his head, as if to warn her not to forget herself. But she could not summon guilt, not in this moment. The smell of spice was in her hair, her clothes, her very skin. She felt almost light-headed, as though the wire had turned to thread and she could step through it if she wished. When the meal was finished, the Americans did something extraordinary. They handed out slices of watermelon, cold and dripping, and let the prisoners sit as long as they liked. Some of the guards even joined them, sitting on overturned crates, swapping jokes. Hank stayed near Liesel's table, not speaking, just watching with a look that was almost protective. When their eyes met, he gave a small nod, just as he had with the apple that first day, and she felt a rush of warmth she could not explain. As dusk fell, the guards herded them gently toward the edge of the yard. Fireworks were set up in the field beyond, and soon the first rockets screamed into the air, bursting in a spray of red fire. The prisoners gasped, some ducking instinctively, others laughing at the shock. More followed, green, gold, white, painting the sky in dazzling arcs. The barbed wire glowed with each explosion, lit as if by lightning. Liesel stood very still, her heart thudding. The sound of the fireworks echoed like distant artillery, yet there was no fear in it, only awe. She felt tears sting her eyes and did not wipe them away. Greta slipped an arm around her shoulders, uncharacteristically silent, and Erica clung to her sleeve, eyes shining. Across the yard, Kurt stood with his face turned upward, the light flashing over his scar. He looked carved from stone. When the final burst faded, leaving smoke curling across the sky, the prisoners began to drift back toward the barracks. But Liesel did not move. She stayed where she was, staring at the fence, now just a black line against the night. The air smelled of smoke and spice, of summer grass crushed underfoot. Somewhere behind her, Hank's voice said softly, "Go on. Take your time." She turned, startled to find him so near. His cap was off, his hair damp with sweat, his expression unreadable. "It was a good show," he said, gesturing toward the sky. "Yes," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. For a moment they stood there, the silence between them more charged than the fireworks had been. She wanted to ask him why he had offered her the apple, why he looked at her as though she were not simply another prisoner. But the words would not come. Instead, she took a step closer to the fence, placed her hand lightly against the wire. It was cool now, humming faintly from the night air. Beyond it, the prairie stretched wide and endless, the stars wheeling overhead. She felt no urge to run, no panic, only a strange, fierce hunger, not for escape but for whatever tomorrow might bring. Behind her, the last of the prisoners were calling to one another, their voices soft with fatigue and something like wonder. Greta's laughter floated through the dark, softer than usual, as though she, too, felt the weight of the moment. Liesel let her hand fall from the wire. The war was still out there, still burning across oceans and continents, but tonight it felt far away, almost unreal. Here, in this improbable place, she had tasted something she could not name, something sharp and sweet and terrifying. She turned toward the barracks at last, her steps slow, her breath steady. Behind her, Hank struck a match, the flare lighting his face for an instant. Kurt's voice carried faintly from the shadows, speaking to the other men in low, urgent tones. The camp was quiet, but not still. Something was moving beneath the surface, a current that would not stop. As she reached the door, a final firework went up, late, unexpected, bursting in a cascade of gold that lit the yard like daylight. Liesel stopped and looked back, her face bathed in light. For a heartbeat, everything was illuminated. The wire, the guards, the barracks, the watching men, the kitchen where the radio still played softly. When the light faded, darkness returned thicker than before. But inside her something remained lit, a small and steady flame. She stepped into the barracks, feeling the spice still burning on her tongue, and thought she would never be the same.